Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 9 of mya222, Maya Foundations, Look Dev and Lighting. So in this class we are going to be moving across to look at optics, so cameras and lenses and how they work and how we can use those to not only obviously look at look development, but also just generally making sure that what we're creating in the computer matches the real world as close as we can. So most visual effects are designed to be photoreal. And what we mean by that is they're designed to look as real or as true to life as they possibly can. And they need to look totally convincing so that the audience doesn't see them. Or if the audience does see them, they still look as photoreal as possible so that the audience believes that what they're looking at is really there. So what I've done is I've got a number of examples to show different types of visual effects so you can kind of see what we're looking to try and do. Okay, so for my first example, I've got this shot from Ant-Man. This is obviously the de-aged Michael Douglas that was done by Lola VFX. You can also see what Michael Douglas looked like 28 years ago when he was in Wall Street, and then another shot of Michael Douglas taken just this year, 2015. So this is an invisible type of visual effect. It's designed for the audience not to know that there's any visual effects taking place. I took my kids to see this. They are all kind of teens or younger, and they had no idea who Michael Douglas was. They hadn't seen any Michael Douglas movies, and when they looked at this image and I spoke to one of them about it, they said that they had no idea that they weren't looking at a real person. So this is a very good example of an invisible visual effects shot. Here we have another shot. This is from Man from U.N.C.L.E. This is done by Rise Effects, very good visual effects company. Now you can see it's kind of got that kind of 1960s, 1970s feel about it. But what's interesting about this invisible visual effects shot is that it is entirely digital. As far as I know, there is nothing in this shot that is real. It was all rendered completely from 3D models. So there's another excellent example of an invisible visual effects shot. And then probably my favorite today, though I'm slightly biased, is this one from Terminator Genesis. Now this again is an invisible visual effects shot. Unless you follow the work of Arnold Schwarzenegger, you would look at this and you would think they've just got a guy who is in the movie, he looks pretty good, and it probably isn't until a few shots later that you see the old Arnold Schwarzenegger facing off that you, if you're savvy, which most people hopefully are, they will look at both the young Arnold Schwarzenegger and the old Arnold Schwarzenegger and go, oh, hold on, this is the same guy. I wonder whether they aged Arnold Schwarzenegger to make him look really old, or what did they do? Now obviously people in the effects industry will know that Arnold Schwarzenegger is getting on in years, and so what we're looking at with this younger version is a completely synthetic version made by MPC in London. So another invisible visual effects shot, not designed to really to call attention to itself, though obviously later in the film the effects really do call attention to themselves, but we love that. So if we now move on to visible visual effects shots, these are visual effects shots in my mind that are designed to be seen. So obviously a very key one would be Jurassic World, Industrial Light and Magic's amazing work. Obviously there is a lot of things in here, mainly dinosaurs, that are meant to be seen, and people are meant to know that looks incredible. But what you can see about this is obviously they have made the dinosaurs look as real as possible. We know dinosaurs don't exist, but we look at this dinosaur and we imagine or believe that it probably does exist in the story and in what we're watching. Probably an even better example of that would be this amazing work by Weta Digital in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. This is probably some of the most seamless creature work in my mind that I've seen to date. Absolutely superb work, and again clearly we do not have talking apes that walk around and look like this, but when you look at it, there is nothing in the shot, nothing in the performance that makes us believe that we are not looking at a real ape. So another visual effects shot. And then finally it would be remiss not to include this shot from the new Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. Again, amazing work by Industrial Light and Magic. Again, clearly impossible. What we're looking at does not exist, but there's nothing in the shot that makes us believe that we are not there flying with Han Solo and Chewbacca in this chase scene. So visible visual effect shots and invisible visual effect shots. Whatever we're trying to do, we're trying to make it look as photoreal as possible. So the first thing we should do when we are beginning look dev and we're thinking about how to put all this together is we need to understand one of the fundamental things about filmmaking, and that is how a camera works. Everything we do, whether it be 3D or whether it be live action, will go through the lens of a camera, be that a real camera like a Arri Alexa or a Red Epic, or even a film camera, or a 3D camera inside of Maya, inside of Houdini, whatever it is that we may be using. But everything is going to go through a camera, and those cameras are going to have certain things attached to them with regards to how they process the information. So let's have a quick look at how cameras work. This is going to be pretty fundamental, but I know some people may not be aware of some of this information, so I just wanted to put it out there right at the beginning. So light basically passes through various lens elements, and you can see in this diagram they are at the front of the lens in this example. Then they go through what is called the aperture, and then you can see the blue line represents this mirror, which is currently down, and the mirror being down enables the light to basically be reflected up and then come out of the eyepiece or the viewfinder so you can see it. As you click the button to take the picture, that blue line, that mirror, flips up, and the light then passes through the lens elements, through the aperture, onto the shutter, which is then open at that point, and then through the shutter onto the sensor or film back, depending on whether it is obviously a digital camera or a traditional film camera. So that is the fundamentals of how a camera works. Now, one of the key aspects of any camera is obviously the lens. Now, you can see from this list that there's many different types of lenses. So you have a wide angle lens, 20mm and under, great for landscapes and architectural work. You have a standard lens, and this would be 35mm to 17mm, and this is great for kind of documentary or street work. Then you have a medium telephoto, or what is sometimes known as a portrait lens, and this would go from 80mm up to 135mm. And obviously, based on the name, it's really good for doing portraits or shots of people. So this could be kind of an over-the-shoulder shot in a movie, something like that, or someone talking to camera, that kind of thing. Then we have a telephoto, and this can go from 135mm right up to 300mm and sometimes beyond. And this is great for kind of sports or wildlife photography. Then we have some specialty lenses. So we have things like the macro lens, which sometimes can go as low as 1:1. And this is great for still life photography where you're trying to get very small things, insects, plants, etc. And then we have our very specialty lenses like our fisheye, which we looked at for our high dynamic range photography earlier in the course. Now, why is this important for us to know? You're probably thinking, aren't we doing look development? Why are we talking about lenses? Well, this is really important when you're choosing the kind of lens that you want to shoot your 3D with. So imagine you have a situation where you're opening your film with a wide panorama. Now, obviously, you could use any lens you want, and you may go, okay, let's use a 50mm, that's what Maya has by default, or a 35mm, that's what Maya has. But if you know about the fact that these kind of lenses are used for these jobs, you can then accurately and artistically choose the right lens. So for an opening shot, which is a wide panorama, you could say, if it was a real cinematographer, he would use a 20mm lens or under. So that is what I'm going to use for what I'm doing. If you were then doing, say, a CG digital double or a CG character, like the one we saw of Arnold Schwarzenegger, you could obviously again use any kind of lens. But we know that our portrait lenses, 80mm to 135, gives the best look for doing that shot. So the chances are the shot that we saw of Arnold Schwarzenegger could have well been taken with a portrait digital lens, something like an 80mm or around about that. So knowing what our lenses do can really help in the look and design of our CG and our look development of a shot or of a character or whatever we're doing. Okay, so from here, let's move across and talk about exposure. Now, the exposure is how much light you're actually getting into the camera and how the film or sensor is being exposed, which is actually obviously capturing the picture. So what you can see here is our exposure triangle. This is pretty well known. Anyone that's looked at photography would probably have seen something similar to this. And the triangle has three sides, as you would expect, and they are made up of the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And between them, they determine how much light is coming into the sensor or onto the film. So let's begin with aperture. The aperture obviously lets more or less light into the lens itself, and the size of the aperture hole is defined as f-stops. Now you can also have t-stops, which are very similar to f-stops, but they are a little bit more technical in that it kind of takes into consideration the glass. But an f-stop is simply how big the hole is. Now, if you double the size of the f-stop, you basically get twice as much brightness. And if you halve the f-stop, it makes the photo half as bright. The size of the aperture has a direct relationship on how much of the image is in focus. So adjusting the aperture affects the depth of field. Now, it's a little bit confusing, this one, because a small f-stop actually is a large hole, and it gives a small or shallow area of focus, whereas a large f-stop actually makes a very small hole, and that you get a large or wide area in focus. So some common numbers you can see at the bottom. So a small f-stop, which is going to give you a very narrow depth of field, a very shallow focus. Small f-stop. A large hole, however, would be something like a 2.8. Whereas if you want to get the whole picture in focus and have everything sharp, you're going to want to go with a small hole, almost like a pinhole camera where everything's in focus, and you would have a number such as f22. And so that's a very small hole, large f-stop number, and you get a very wide area in focus in your image. So here's some examples that I've got for you. You can see here in the first image on the left hand side, we've got an f-stop of 1.4. You can see really just the area on the pillar is in focus. F-stop of 4, you're getting a lot more in focus. The background is nowhere near as blurred. And when you go up to f-stop of 8, we're getting a lot of the background in focus. It's still not as sharp as the kind of foreground area, the pillar area, but it's still much more in focus than it was at 1.4. So that is your aperture. Again, determining how big the hole is determines how much light comes in, but also with the aperture, it determines how much of the image is in focus. Next up, we have the shutter speed. And the shutter is something that opens, that enables light to go through onto the sensor or onto the film. And the shutter speed is simply the amount of time that the shutter is open for, and it's measured in seconds or fractions of a second. So a shutter speed that is 1 second, the shutter basically moves out of the way for a second and then quickly closes. So if you double the shutter speed, so it opens twice as quick, you halve the amount of light. And if you halve the shutter speed, so it obviously opens slower, you get twice the brightness coming in. Now, this also has implications on another area, and that area is motion blur. So if you have a fast shutter that opens and closes very quickly, you have less motion blur. But if you have a slow shutter, you get more motion blur. So these are some examples of some common shutter speeds and kind of what you could do with them. So right at the top, you can see an extremely fast shutter speed. It's literally open for a 4,000th of a second, so incredibly fast. And this would be fantastic for doing extremely fast moving objects. If you drop down to something like 2,000ths of a second, you can actually freeze birds in flight. So if you're trying to take a picture of an eagle or a hummingbird, something like that, a very fast shutter speed is what you're looking for. If you drop down to something like, if you're, say, panning the camera with a cyclist going past or a fast-moving vehicle, then a 125th of a second will get you a nice, crisp image. If you're trying to get something like somebody walking, then if you have a 1/4 of a second or a 1/4 of a second, you're still going to get a little bit of blur with somebody walking. And if you have the shutter open for a second or longer, you're going to kind of get that misty, milky water effect that you sometimes see. So here's some examples. So at 4/1000ths of a second, you can see I've got this image of an eagle that's been captured. If you go down to 1/1000ths of a second, you can get a really nice capture of like a rally car going around a corner or something like that. 1/15th of a second will get you a nice crisp image of somebody running. And a 2-second image will freeze water and you get this kind of misty look that you've probably seen. So that's shutter speed, and how long the shutter is will determine again how much motion blur you're going to have in the image. The final side of our triangle is the ISO, and the ISO basically defines how the camera, film or sensor is sensitive to light. So doubling the ISO makes the photo twice as bright. It basically makes it twice as sensitive to light, and halving the ISO makes the photo half as bright, so it becomes less sensitive to light. So a higher ISO makes it more grainy if it's film, or more noisy if it's digital, and you'd use a higher ISO if you wanted to film something at night. So often if you see night photography or you try and shoot something dark with your iPhone, you'll find you get a very noisy, grainy image. Whereas if you have a very low ISO, something like 100 or 200, you're really going to get no grain at all, and that's going to give you the crispest image. So some common numbers for ISOs are things like 100, 200, 400. They're really low ISO numbers. You're great for doing kind of outdoor shots in the daytime, that kind of thing. And then you can have ISO numbers right at the other end of the spectrum, like 51,000 or even 100,000 ISO, which are designed to take photos at night or in very dark situations. So you can see here we've got a couple of examples. Firstly, we've got the Golden Gate Bridge that has been shot using 100, 800, 1600 and 3200, and you can see as you go across into those higher ISO numbers, the image progressively gets more and more grainy. And then you can see this amazing photo of these rhinos, and that was taken at 100,000 ISO. You can see it's incredibly crisp. This was taken with the new Canon mya222. So this is a new camera that's come out from Canon very recently, and it is excellent at doing very high ISO photography. It gives you a very clean image, but normally you wouldn't be able to get an image this clean with this high ISO. So those are your three sides of your exposure triangle: aperture, which is also f-stop, shutter speed and ISO. Now let's move into Maya for a moment. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a camera in Maya. Now when we look at this, if we close down some of these areas, you can see if you're using Mental Ray, you get a little Mental Ray tab here, and you have the ability to add a lens shader. So I can click on here and I can come into our lenses here under our Mental Ray section. If I just close these other sections up, and you can see here we have a MIA exposure photography or photographic, exposure simple and a lens bokeh. So if you go with the MIA exposure photographic, you can see that you then have the ability to actually add things like camera shutter, film, ISO and various other things that give you slightly more real kind of photographic effects. You can also add new parameters if you're using RenderMan. So I can come in and I can go to Attributes, RenderMan, and add aperture controls and shutter controls. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can see down here now we have some additional controls for bokeh, which is obviously depth of field. We have the depth of field aspect ratio, and we have a shutter opening where we can determine how much the shutter's open for. So at the moment it's from 0 to 1 or 0 to 360. If I wanted to make this say 0.5, that's going to open at the beginning and then close halfway through the cycle, giving you a 180-degree cycle, which is obviously open just for half a second. So a very filmic effect would be something like 178.2, which is slightly less than 180 that you probably are familiar with, but it's taken into account kind of flickering from fluorescent tubes and things like that. And what you'd probably choose to do is set it to 0.25 to to 0.75, and that would mean that it was open in the middle of the shutter sequence. So you can do various things like that if you want to. Okay, so from here, let's go back to our slides for a moment. Now, the next important thing for us to look at when doing any form of look development is an understanding of resolution versus film back. Now, hopefully everyone's going to know this, but I wanted to cover it just in case there's anybody that's not familiar with the difference between resolution and film back. So if we turn to Maya for a moment, I just make another camera. You can see that in here we have our film back and we have our film back here. But if we go to our render settings, we obviously also have under here our resolution. If I just come down here, here it is here, our resolution. And you also, when you look through your camera, you have the ability here under your view to do it based on your film gate, which looks like that, or your resolution gate, which looks like that. And you have those up here as well. So I can go film gate, resolution gate. So you can see just straight off the bat, making a basic camera inside of Maya, they are very different. So what is the difference between these two? Which one do you need? Because when you start getting into things like fit resolution gate, you can fit it to various kind of sizes. You can also determine whether you're going to have things set to the resolution gate or set to the film gate. There's a whole bunch of things that bring these two concepts together. So let's again just return to our slides. And you can see here that the resolution itself is the size of the image. Basically defines how big the image is in width and height. And this is normally defined obviously in pixels. And you can see some examples here. So this is very common. Anyone that's rendered anything in Maya ever, which is probably everyone watching this, these are going to be normal things you're used to. What is the resolution of my render? So PAL widescreen would be 1024 576. You've got 1920 1080 for HD and 2048 by 1556 for 2K film. Really basic stuff. Now, resolution also has non-square pixels, so you could choose NTSC, PAL, or even 2K CinemaScope, and they all have slightly different aspect ratios to the pixel. So that basically means that your pixels will be squeezed either in thinner or out wider to give you what's known as an anamorphic image. Now, what about film back? The film back size defines how big the sensor or actual film back of the camera, which is the gate or the aperture of the camera itself, how big is that area? It's basically the area that captures the image. Now this is normally defined in millimeters or inches. And when you add CG into a live action plate or do any form of kind of camera tracking, it's essential that you know this information. So some examples of a film back resolution or film back size include the ARRI Alexa. You can see that's about 23.7 by 12.8. Red Epic is 27.6 by 14.5. A Super 35mm film back would be 24.8 by 18.6. And if you go up to a huge IMAX, you've got 70mm, which is obviously the very famous number with IMAX, 70mm by 48.5mm. So this defines the actual size of the film back itself. So again, if we go back into Maya, you can see under the film back, we have various options. So there's our 35mm, and you can see that it's the 24.8 by 18.6 that we talked about. It also tells us in Maya what size it is in inches. You can see that we have our 70mm IMAX again here, or 70mm projection. We have VistaVision. We have a whole bunch of ones in here. IMAX right at the bottom. There's our 70mm by 52.6. Or you can actually go ahead and just do a user one. So we could put in the film back size for a Red Epic or an ARRI Alexa, whatever you may need. Now the fit resolution gate, normally you want that set to horizontal. That's what I usually have it set to. And if you're trying to match things up between Maya and Nuke that you've rendered inside of Maya, and you're trying to get them to match up with a background plate in Nuke, it's really important that this is set to horizontal, otherwise it just feels like the renders inside of Maya don't match up with a render coming out of your scanline renderer in Nuke. So make sure that's always set to horizontal. Okay, so that is the film back size. Now before we move away from this section, I just want to talk a little bit about camera limitations. Now some of this doesn't affect us as kind of look dev artists or lighters, because the last point is really an animation point, but the first two definitely do. We need to be aware of our exposure triangle all the time whenever we're doing any form of look dev or lighting. We know now how a camera works. We have aperture, we have shutter speed, and we have ISO, and we know what those three do if you push them too hard. It either gives you very low depth of field, we either get a grainy image, or you get a lot of kind of motion blur. So imagine you are look deving a scene that's going to be taking place at night. If it's going to be very dark, think about what would a real camera do in those instances. Either you'd have to use very high ISO, so you'd get a slightly grainy image, or you're going to have the aperture open really wide to let the light in because it's a dark scene, and therefore you're going to get very shallow depth of field, or you're going to have the shutter speed quite slow in order to let more light in because again it's a dark scene, and therefore you're going to get more motion blur than you might choose to. So whenever you're doing look dev and whenever you're lighting, think about what is actually happening with the light coming into your camera, because our cameras inside of Maya don't give us these limitations. We actually have to put them onto the camera if we want to be true to photography. Also, we need to be aware that most cameras do not do tone mapping of high dynamic range information on the fly. So if you look at the two images below, the one on the right has been tone mapped. It's basically taken multiple exposures and it's used the tone mapping technique in order to get the outside windows and the lights above the table to look really nice, while the inside of the room also looks nice. The image on the left hand side, however, has just been taken with a single image, and what they've done is they've exposed that image, that photograph, for the inside of the room. And because they've done that, the lights that are significantly brighter and the window, which is obviously letting in a lot of sunlight, they are completely blown out, and that's what you would expect. If you wanted a real camera not to blow those lights out and the patio doors so you could actually see what was outside, you would need to stop down maybe 2 or 3 times. Then you would be able to see the lights, you'd be able to see outside the door, but what you would find is that the room itself would become very dark. So again, think about how you're doing things. Think about, if I have a window in the scene and I'm exposing to that, the rest of the room needs to be quite dark. Or you're going to be having to maybe fake it, but don't fake it too much so it looks weird. The final thing, which I said at the beginning was more to do with animation, is really about moving the camera and making sure that if you are someone that is animating a camera, you're staying within the realms of reality. And what I mean by that is a camera has to sit on something. It's either a steady cam sat on a person that they're moving around, or it's going to be on some kind of rigs, maybe tracks, maybe on a crane, something like that. But we don't have cranes that are like 100 feet high or rigs that can go at 300 miles an hour. We have limitations on physics and limitations on the equipment we have. If you have a shot where you see something that is unrealistic in its camera move, it really takes you out of the film. So a good example would be if you think about Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, some of the scenes in the mines with all the goblins, they had very wide sweeping camera moves around that mine system. And when you look at it, you think, where on earth is the camera and how can it take a picture like that? Now, obviously it looks very dramatic, it looks amazing when he does it, but it takes you out of the film slightly, or it takes me out of the film because it just seems unnatural. Another director that likes to move the camera around in a more unrealistic way is Robert Zemeckis. Now, both of these directors are obviously extremely good directors and they can do whatever they want with their films. But you need to make sure that if you're going to do something amazing with your camera, that you don't push it too far so the audience kind of realizes that something's wrong and gets taken out of the film, because then you're not serving the story. And after all, everything we're trying to do is serve the story and make the best film experience. So they're just some camera limitations to think about. Now, I'm going to change subjects quite a lot now and talk about cropped censored cameras. Now, this often comes up where you have a camera that is not a full frame camera. So an example would be a Canon 5D Mark II or Mark III or even the Mark IV is a full frame 36 by 24 millimeter camera. But if you have something like the Canon 7D, it's a cropped sensor. The camera sensor is smaller. And you can see here in this example the difference between a Canon 5D full sensor and the Canon 7D cropped sensor. It's dramatically smaller. Instead of being 36 millimeters across, it's only 22.3. And instead of being 24 millimeters high, it's actually only 14.9 millimeters. Now, if you crop down the sensor, it has a dramatic effect on the actual lensing that's taken place. So have a look at this image. Here we have a camera lens right in the middle. And you can see that at the top, we've got the correct angle of view, or the 35 millimeters, 50 millimeter size when using a full frame sensor. And you can see that if you follow those red lines down, they diagonally go through the camera lens and they end up at the bottom at the full frame sensor, 36 by 24. Now, if you use a cropped sensor, in order to get the information on the sensor, obviously the triangle at the top is also made smaller. You can see how that works. And therefore your lens that you're using stops being the actual lens it says. So potentially if you were using a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame sensor, and then you took the same 50 millimeter lens and put it on a cropped sensor camera, it no longer is actually a 50 millimeter lens. So how does it work? So let's take, for instance, 28 millimeters. What would happen if you took a 28 millimeter lens and you put it onto a cropped sensor Canon 7D? Well, first of all, we need to do some maths in order to work out what is going on. So the Canon 7D sensor size is 22.3 millimeters by 14.9 millimeters. And the maths is we basically need to take the full frame sensor in its X and Y and then divide it by the cropped frame sensor X and Y. So we take our full frame 36 width and divide it by 22.3, and that gives you 1.61. And then we take our 24 millimeter height of the full frame sensor and we divide it by the cropped frame sensor size, which is 14.9, and that gives us 1.61. Then we average the result of the X and Y. So we basically take 1.614 and we add it to 1.610 and we divide it by 2, and that gives us the size of 1.61254. And the more decimal places you have, the more accurate this is going to be. Then the lens size you basically times by the value that we just got, the average value we've got. So our 28 millimeter lens we times by 1.61254, and that comes to 45.15. So in answer to our question, what would happen if we put a 28 millimeter lens onto a Canon 7D? The answer is that the 28 millimeter lens then becomes what would be a 45 millimeter lens. So if you're doing something like camera tracking, or you're using the information in Nuke to do something, or even Maya, and you've got a 7D piece of footage, you know that it was shot with a physical 28 millimeter lens, the number that you put into the software when it says what kind of lens did I use is this converted number. So you say 7D physical 28 millimeter lens, it actually was in reality a 45 millimeter lens, and that will make a massive difference in when you're doing camera match moving or setting up your Nuke scene or even your Maya scene for whatever it is that you may be doing. Okay, so I think that is going to take us to the end of our class. We must be about 35 minutes in, so I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions about any of the things we've talked about in this class, there's obviously been a lot of theory, but I wanted to do that for this class. So if you have any questions about cameras in any way, it'd be great to have a discussion in the forums. Next week we are going to be looking at deep compositing in a lot of detail, so I'm really looking forward to that final class. But again, any questions, please put them in the forums, and as always, until next week, this is Matt Leonard for FX PhD.